Okay. So I will. I'm not craning round things. Celebrating her 33rd birthday with Leonard, who was treating her to a day out. I like those relationships, those marriages where you keep your own money so that you can treat the other person, which seems to me a very sensible thing to do. Treating her to a day out in London on the 25th of January 1915. Virginia Woolf recorded, "I don't know when I have enjoyed a birthday so much. Not since I was a child, anyhow. Sitting at tea, we decided three things. In the first place, to take Hogarth House, which was a house in Richmond that they had fallen in love with, if we can get it. In the second, to buy a printing press. In the third, to buy a bulldog, probably called John. I am very much excited at the idea of all three, particularly the press." I'm rather disappointed. I thought she was going to say particularly the bulldog. I was also given a packet of sweets to bring home. It just indicates, I think, the austerity of the Woolf's life in general. The Woolfs took Hogarth House in Richmond, after which they named the press, as they had wanted, and though they failed to get the bulldog by John or any other name, they were able also to buy a printing press, but not until 2 years later, in 1917, March 1917. So the idea comes to them in 1915, and they don't buy it until 1917. The reason for the long delay was Leonard's main motive for wanting one in the first place, which was Virginia's fragile mental state at this time. She was on the brink of a second nervous breakdown when she wrote that entry in her diary in 1915. And Leonard believed that the main reason her health broke down periodically was because she worked too hard. And he thinks, particularly on her fiction, and he thought that to prevent this, well, by providing her with something that was not fiction, but was words, but was related in some way, that they might avert another breakdown. He was also genuinely interested in learning to print himself. But it was not until March 1917, as I say, that he needed, or that he got the opportunity to provide the press, and by this time she needed it more severely than ever. She was working harder than ever. Apart from writing regular reviews for the Times Literary Supplement, she'd started a second novel, Night and Day, which would come out with her brother-in-law in 1919, and was experimenting with short pieces like The Mark on the Wall. "I have never known anyone," Leonard wrote, "work with more intense, more indefatigable concentration than Virginia." This was particularly the case, he says, when she was writing a novel. The novel became part of her, and she herself was absorbed into the novel. She wrote only in the mornings. This reassured me, because I start later, but I finish later. She wrote only in the mornings from 10 to 1, and usually she typed out in the afternoon what she had written by hand in the morning. But all day long, when she was walking through London streets, or on the Sussex Downs, or over the water meadows, or along the River Ouse, the book would be moving subconsciously in her mind, or she herself would be moving in a dreamlike way through the book. It was this intense absorption which made her writing so exhausting mentally for her. And all through her life, he writes, she tried to keep two kinds of writing going simultaneously, fiction and criticism. After some weeks on the novel, she would switch to criticism as a relief or rest, because though she devoted great care and concentration even to the simplest, most unimportant review, the part of her mind which she used for criticism or even biography was different from the part she used for fiction. I don't know whether the fiction writers among you will recognise this. The relief or relaxation which she obtained from this change in the angle of her mental vision was of the same kind, he says, of a man who's working very hard at one thing and then finds relief in a hard game of chess. He said it's a mental effort, but it's a different kind of mental effort. The difficulty with Virginia was to find any play sufficiently fascinating or absorbing to take her mind off her work. He says, we were both interested in printing and had from time to time, in a casual way, talked about the possibility of learning to print. It struck me that it would be the ideal occupation for Virginia in the afternoon to take off her mind off her work completely. Even when Virginia seemed better towards the end of 1916, however, and ready to learn the art of printing, this proved not at all easy, in Leonard's understated words. When we went to the St. Bride's School of Printing, down Bridle Lane, Fleet Street, and it's so lovely visiting all these places in London, you know, aren't I lucky? Yes. We learned that the social engine and machinery made it impossible to teach the art of printing to two middle-aged, middle-class people. About time they learnt that, wasn't it? Printing could only be taught to trade union apprentices, the number of which was strictly limited, so they seemed to end their career before it had begun. The answer to their problem came in an unexpected way. They were walking up Farringdon Street, coming back from Richmond, either going to the station, coming back from the station in Holborn, to Holborn Viaduct in the city of London, when they passed the Excelsior Printing Press, the Excelsior Printing Supply Company, with its goods displayed temptingly in the window. They stared at these, Leonard said, rather like two hungry children gazing at buns in a baker's shop window. He's not a bad writer himself, actually. I like Leonard. Excelsior Printing Supply Company provided them not only with a printing machine, I can actually show you the printing machine. Yeah, printing machine. That is the Hogarth Press, which my husband had in his lavatory before I knew him, actually. When I knew him, our lavatory was a lot smaller. But he had this in his lavatory for many years, but he said it was rather large and sold it for £25. I think that was a very bad decision. I'll say more about that later on. But it arrived with a 16-page set. It arrived when they got it. They bought it for £19, 5 shillings and 5 pence. This being Leonard, it's very accurate and detailed. When the press was delivered to Hogarth House in Richmond, the only place they could find for it was in the dining room, where it remained for the rest of their stay until 1923. Virginia's dinner invitation to Peter Sackville West in 1923 has become well known. We don't so much dine as picnic. As the press has got into the larder and the dining room, it not only ousted them from the dining room, but crept all over the house, making everything, according to Virginia Woolf, incredibly untidy. The press's actual arrival was not without its problems. When it arrived, they found they were going to install it, very heavy, and then they found that it was actually in 2 pieces. It had cracked in transit. But the shop, she says, has probably got a spare part. She's writing to her sister, Vanessa. Anyhow, the arrangement of the type is such a business, she writes, that we shan't be ready to start printing directly. And I don't know whether any of you have done hand printing. Made me feel, one person has, and it made me feel very relieved that I hadn't investigated that area. One has great blocks of type which have to be divided into their separate letters and fonts, and then put into the right partitions. The work of ages, especially when you mix up the H's with the N's, which I did frequently. Well, she still did, actually. I've seen some of our early Hogarth Press publications where it's quite obvious that she's mixed the H's with the N's. It's quite easy to do. We get so absorbed, she said, we can't stop. I see that real printing will devour one's entire life. It was not the only occasion on which Virginia was to mix the H's with the N's, as I said, for she did not prove to be the ideal typesetter. But then Leonard, who had inherited the family's shaky hand, I probably talked about it before, in order to drink a cup of tea, he would often have to tie a handkerchief round his wrist and pull it up with his other hand to make sure it was stable, which was very distressing to him. So he couldn't set the type. It would have been all over the place. Instead, he had the equally demanding task of machining the text on their small hand press. I mean, for those of you who don't know about hand printing, it's a fascinating story because I had never realized how much actually went into just producing one page of type. Writing to her friend Margaret Llewellyn Davis on the 2nd of May 1917, after only a week of printing, Virginia writes, "You must keep us all at bay until you are prepared to fling yourself into the most absorbing of all pursuits. After 2 hours' work at the press, Leonard heaved a terrific sigh and said, 'I wish to God we'd never bought the cursed thing.' To my great relief, though not surprise," he added, "because I shall never do anything else." You can't think how exciting, she says, soothing, ennobling, and satisfying it is. And so far we've only done the dullest and most difficult parts, setting up a notice, which you will receive one day, and meanwhile our brains buzz with all sorts of works. So they're full of ideas. They're starting it originally, or Leonard started it originally, because of Virginia's mental health that he was concerned for. But it went on, as you'll see, in the way that these ventures often do, into other areas. Leonard's original intention, which was to distract Virginia from overwork with some interesting manual labour, was not only failing to stop Virginia from working hard, it was actually making her work harder, but of course in a different area. But quickly, their ideas expanded to include more idealistic aims of, and I'm quoting, producing, this is Leonard, producing works of genuine merit. I mean, this is the interesting thing about private printing, isn't it? Private press printing. What is it that starts the person? What is it that motivates the person who is doing the private printing? In their case, they want to print works which could scarcely hope to secure publication through ordinary channels. They were both resolved to produce no books, they said, merely with a view to pecuniary profit. In this, the Wolfes resembled their friend Roger Fry, an art critic I mentioned yesterday in my talk on the Bloomsbury Group. He'd set up the Omega Workshop 4 years earlier in 1913 in the hope of helping struggling young artists. So there is a kind of idealistic strain beginning to creep in to their work, as it was with Roger Fry. In fact, the Wolfes, consciously or unconsciously, were almost certainly influenced by the Omega Press, which, after producing several books in its brief lifetime, 1913 to 1919, closed down leaving them with the legacy, if you like, of an idealistic enterprise which was concentrating on quality. So what started as self-publication on Leonard and Virginia's work, 2 stories, which I'm going to talk about. That's the first book of the Hogarth Press in its original cover, quickly branched out into offering the public works which would not otherwise have reached them, and I think that applies across the board in private press publishing. Many of them ahead of their time, as they were. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, and I'm terribly excited. Somebody has brought me his original copy of that. Okay. I'll write it back at some point.
Wow.
T.S. Eliot's The Waste Man. I didn't have it when I was taking the photographs or taking the slides here. I won't move again. I'll be stuck in my place. Maybe I'll have a long arm. But this has been bound in leather on the spine here, which was not the Hogarth Press, but this original paper was probably chosen by Virginia Woolf because she had been an amateur bookbinder, and she had taken on the job of binding. In her case, this meant simply sewing the thing through the centre and sticking the covers on, and she's always complaining about how many millions of covers she has to stick on. I think you're probably allowed to look at that. I'm not sure about touching it. But very exciting, thank you very much. And though the Hogarth Press was by no means the first small press to be founded in the early 20th century, it was distinguished from the majority of them in this and other ways: the fact that they would bind their own books, and that they were more interested in content than in the paper or the printing. Like Fry at the Omega, and despite the inspiration Fry had got from William Morris and his Kelmscott Press, the Woolf's aims were not those of the highly skilled craftsman. There were already by 1917 a significant number of small presses whose main interest was in the fine printing rather than the content of the books they produced. There was one called the Arachne Press, then there was the Doves Press, Ashendene Press, Vale Press, and Francis Mennell's Pelican Press, started in 1915, was more what the Woolfs had in mind, but this was discontinued in 1918. So really, there weren't many people doing what they were doing, which was publishing literature as cheaply as they could, that would otherwise not be published. We did not want Hogarth Press to become one of those admirable in their way, Leonard says, private or semi-private presses, the object of which is finely produced books, which are not meant to be read, but to be looked at. He and Virginia were more interested in what the author had to say than how they said it, he said. Of course, they wanted Hogarth books to look nice, but neither of them was interested in fine printing or binding in itself. They positively disliked what he called the refinement and preciosity of such efforts, which seemed to them too often a kind of fungoid growth which culture breeds upon art and literature. Like Fry at the Omega, it was the freshness and vigour of the work, rather than the polish of craftsmanship, which came first for Hogarth. Once that was achieved, they did what they could to make their books look attractive. And these are two of the woodcuts from that early book. For the book, they ordered 4 woodcuts from their artist friend Dora Carrington. And Virginia says that she particularly liked the servant girl with the plates and the snail, which I think is beautiful, don't you? for her own The Mark on the Wall, which was the second of those 2 stories in 2 stories. One was by Leonard, I told you it was self-publication, and the second one was 2 stories. That was The Mark on the Wall by Virginia. To add to the book's visual appeal, they hoped, Virginia bought a variety of decorative papers. She even talked of learning the art of marbling paper, so that, as you see from the Eliot book, that's a marbled paper, in order to do it herself. I don't think she ever got that far. And to keep costs to a minimum, they bound their own books, as I indicated. Leonard claimed that one of the reasons for the eventual success of the Hogarth Press was that they had no overheads. The printing was done in their home, in the dining room, as you heard. They didn't pay themselves for their time, and any profit they made was always reinvested. This may have been the case, but Leonard was undoubtedly one of the reasons for the commercial success of the press. He was indefatigable, and he was always very careful about detail. Detail to him was almost like a god. It was something that mattered. Remember, he counted the yield of the apples that came from their apple tree. It amused Virginia, I suppose, rather than letting it enrage. Do you think? I think it might enrage me. But he was very, very meticulous, and his accounts were always absolutely wonderful and immaculate. And in addition, of course, to their own talent as writers, which was a not inconsiderable part of their success. I mean, imagine being the first person to publish Virginia Woolf's short stories, which of course are the modernist bit of it early on. And imagine having book covers by 2 of the leading artists of the day, Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell, having woodcuts by Dora Carrington. This was indeed a great privilege. They had not just artists in their wide circle of friends, but also, and what can one say? I mean, how lucky can you be? T.S. Eliot, Catherine Mansfield, E.M. Forster, all these people who in themselves became names in modernism and forwarded the cause. Many of them published first by the Hogarth Press, and Leonard, amongst other things, was the first to publish Sigmund Freud in English. They had a Russian friend, Kotelyansky, amongst the Bloomsbury group, and Virginia was particularly keen on Russian literature, which influenced her own literature deeply. And so Leonard took on the translations of the proceedings of the Freud Society. Not only did the Wolfs make a small profit on their first book, 2 stories, but more significantly for posterity, self-publication encouraged Virginia in her work. Her work, which was to revolutionise the English novel in the 20th century. I dare say one ought to invent a completely new form, Virginia wrote to another English prose writer, David Garnett, the week after 2 stories was posted off to buyers. She found traditional novels, quote, frightfully clumsy and overpowering, jolting, then added, anyhow, it's very amusing to try with these short things in the greatest mercy, and the greatest mercy to be able to do what one likes. No editors or publishers, except of course themselves, and only people to read who more or less like that sort of thing. And I do believe that that was probably one of the most crucial functions of the Hogarth Press, that it encouraged her to experiment freely. In other words, freedom from supervision encouraged her in her experiments, which turned that novel of the 19th century into a great modernist experiment. As you know, she published her first novel, The Voyage, out 1915 with her half-brother, Gerald Duckworth, and she had already committed her second novel, Night and Day, 1919, to her half-brother, but after that she was free, she said. Free to publish what she liked. She felt she was the luckiest lady in England. She felt her brother, her half-brother Gerald Duckworth, couldn't tell a book from a beehive, which I think is one of her even wittier sayings than some of the others, and was delighted to be able to publish all 7 of her subsequent novels with Leonard at the Hogarth Press. Her genius would probably have survived anyway, but it flourished there, with Leonard, who was a severe critic, but who was on the same wavelength, and he understood what she was trying to do. And this editorial tolerance and response to new experiments in writing was almost certainly to help the next author they published, Catherine Mansfield. That's the notice they sent out. Produced so painfully and painstakingly by Virginia and Leonard, their first attempt at printing. Actually, I couldn't find any confusions between the H's and the N's there, but never mind. And this is Prelude. Virginia seems to have calmed herself down for this one with a plain blue cover. And it was Virginia herself who became a sort of tout for the press. She said to Vanessa, "I'm going to see Catherine Mansfield to get a story from her, perhaps." This was in April 1917, shortly after they'd started. The story she immediately suggested, Prelude, was a thoroughly revised version of an earlier one called The Alley, and it marked a significant change in subject matter and method for the New Zealand writer who went on to become one of the best-known short story writers of the period. Looking back on the production of Prelude, Leonard Woolf was astonished at his daring, his courage, in taking it on only a year after they'd introduced themselves to printing. Don't forget, they didn't know how to print. It was at 68 pages. It was twice as long as the 2 stories, with a print run over twice the length of their first book. Since it would have taken far too much time to do it themselves on the hand press, they set it, and Leonard machined it with a friendly printer around the corner called MacDermott. Well, the Woolf's relationship with MacDermott is delightful, because MacDermott was a lovely man, but MacDermott was not a good printer. And Leonard, who has a very dry sense of humour, which, if we have time for discussion, I'll tell you about. Leonard was quite kind about MacDermott, but quite firm about MacDermott's limitations. He produced, so they allowed him to publish Monday or Tuesday, a subsequent book, and as well as Prelude. And he said it was extraordinary. He said he produced a nasty, spongy, antique wove paper. And ignorant as I was in those days about paper and printing, I had my doubts about it from the first. I went down and helped him to print the beastly thing. I have never seen a more desperate, ludicrous, but for me at that time tragic, scene than MacDermott printing Monday or Tuesday. He insisted upon printing the woodcuts with the letterpress. Well, those of you who are printers will know the problem. The consequence was that in order to get the right colour for the illustrations, i.e. enough black in the thing, he had to get 4 or 5 times more ink on his rollers than was right for the type. And of course with the spongy antique paper, you can see his type was soon clogged with ink, but even that was not the worst. He got so much ink on the blocks, and his paper was so soft and spongy that little fluffy bits of paper were torn off with the ink and stuck to the blocks, and then to the rollers, and finally to the type. We had to stop every few minutes and clean everything, but even so, the pages were an appalling sight. We machined 1,000 copies, and at the end we sank down exhausted and speechless on the floor by the side of the machine, where we sat and silently drank beer until I was sufficiently revived to crawl back, battered and broken, to Hogarth House. So you do understand why after that they very politely declined Dermot's offers of help. By having Monday or Tuesday printed for them by a commercial printer, however, they were turning the corner. They were taking a new step, abandoning the original idea of the press, which had been to print themselves. In fact, they had already in 1919 been forced to a similar step on a path which would end in them becoming regular and professional publishers. In late 1918, they had printed 3 small books: Poems by T.S. Eliot, The Critic in Judgment by Middleton Murray, who was married to Catherine Mansfield, and Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf. Publications which Virginia describes entertainingly as is her wont to her friend Violet Dickinson. My Violet, it is very good of you to throw £1 into our jaws when you know nothing of what you may get out of them. Mr. Eliot is an American of the highest culture, so that his writing is almost unintelligible. Middleton Murray edits the Athenaeum and is also very obscure. I mean, you have to shut your door and give yourself a quiet few days. Not for Kew Gardens, though. That is as simple as can be, which of course just isn't true, as I know, when you try to teach the text. For their first book, they had not sent out review copies, but for Prelude and Critic in Judgment and Kew Gardens, they sent out reviews to the TLS. They went off for a week's holiday to their house in Sussex, and when they came back, when we opened the door, Leonard recalled, to Hogarth House, we found the hall covered with, and I've had this experience once with our press, it's very, very exciting. We found the hall covered with envelopes and postcards containing orders from booksellers all over the country. It was impossible for us to start printing enough copies to meet these orders. So we went to a printer, Richard Manley, and he prints it for them. So of course that was another step on the way to becoming commercial. The Wolves were now technically proper commercial publishers and never looked back. So many writers as friends, of course, manuscripts were not difficult to come by. Though not always, as Virginia Woolf herself confessed, of a book by Logan Pearsall Smith, who was an American essayist, not always of the very highest standard, she admitted, of prose composition. But then, what is one to do, she asked her friend, Lady Robert Cecil. 3 poets, 1 female, which made it worse, have been rejected. It's all very well talking of young writers of genius, but my belief is that they died out a year after I was born. And modesty forbids me to draw the inference from that. Despite her pessimism, and as I indicated, the Hogarth Press during its first 2 years of existence had already published some of the greatest names in modernist fiction in England: Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Catherine Mansfield, E.M. Forster. And in the next few years would add E.M. Forster, as well as a radically experimental poem, Paris, by a young unknown writer, Hope Merlis, and a translation of Gorky's Reminiscences of Tolstoy, brought to them by that Russian member of their group, Kotelyansky. But the Wolf's list was not limited to their friends, fortunately. It would also include many of the writers we have now come to regard as classics, who were not always recognized in their day: Freud, Chekhov, Tolstoy, Rilke, which I think was a marvelous choice. I love Rilke. H.G. Wells, Christopher Isherwood, and many others. There's one unlikely candidate which proved to have a great hit. I think it was John Hampden, Saturday Night at the Greyhound. Does anybody know this title? Well, this was a bestseller. Of course, there were other bestsellers. Virginia's Orlando was a bestseller. Her book Flush, which is the biography of Virginia Woolf, taken from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, taken from the Spaniel's point of view, charming book, and other ones. Her growing fame as a novelist was undoubtedly important to the success of the Hogarth Press, but Leonard's contribution would be just as vital, since, as I've indicated, he was very, very meticulous and had a passion for detail. His budgeting, his pricing, as much a distinguished characteristic of his work. And Hogarth, I think, benefiting as much from Leonard as from what the historian of the press, J.H. Willis, claims was a distinguished, a great novelist with composing stick in hand. Virginia Woolf, inky and determined. I mean, she undoubtedly added to the lustre of the press, although, of course, when they started in 1917, she was virtually unknown. Leonard was just importantly a highly perceptive critic. It was he who had recognised Virginia's genius from the start, and he who had invited T.S. Eliot, as a young, virtually unknown poet, to publish his poems with Hogarth, and then go on to bring out the first British edition of The Waste Land in 1923. Was his one famous mistake, which you may know, was turning down Ulysses by James Joyce. Imagine having to live with that. I mean, yes, great pride in publishing Eliot's poems when he was unknown in 1918, and then his Waste Land in 1923. But how awful to have turned down Ulysses. And actually, it was as much to do with Virginia's prejudice against James Joyce, one can't help suspecting a little jealousy on her part, as it was to do with Leonard's own judgment. Added to that was the fact that it was libellous in the mind of the British establishment. So Leonard, on the whole, didn't really have much choice there. Apart from that, he made some very good choices. But it was, above all, a personal affair, as you can see from that anecdote, run by Leonard and Virginia themselves. In the midst of printing Prelude, for instance, when they heard of the death of Leonard's younger brother Cecil in France in 1917, they interrupted proceedings of the second book, that was Prelude, to print a small collection of Cecil's poems. Cecil had been killed at the Battle of Bourlon Wood, with Philip, his youngest brother, who became my father-in-law, that is to say Cecil's father, called Cecil after the uncle who'd been killed, and by the same German shell which wounded Philip. And while convalescing, Philip in London had brought some of Cecil's poems to Virginia and Leonard, and they had realised that by printing them they would help him. They didn't rate the poems. Virginia didn't rate the poems very highly, although she was entirely in favour of printing it. And it's that kind of thing that makes it a personal undertaking. I mean, largely commercial by the later years, but definitely ready for the human touch. The slim 19-page edition of the poems of C.M. Sidney Wolfe, in its plain white wrappers, ironically, is probably the most valuable of the Hogarth Press books, since there were only about 15, 20 published. We had one for a time until our own publishing venture ran out of money and we ran out of money, so we no longer have it, I'm afraid. I would like to have been able to wave it around. But its promotion and its production, I think, shows just how personal it was. When, with the purchase of a larger printing press in 1921, there was a subsequent expansion of their business, encouraged by the Wolf's move to 52 Tavistock Square in Bloomsbury, they started selling books directly to booksellers and increased their annual output of titles. They were forced over time to take on a series of assistants and managers, which didn't always work out well because Leonard, in his precision and his hard workingness, was not an easy boss. Not an easy boss at all. He expected from them the same punctiliousness and hard work as he expected of himself. Even Cecil, my husband, admitted that his uncle was not an easy man to work with. Those who worked at the press included Barbara Hiles, Alex Sargent Florence, all sort of minor names in Bloomsbury. Alex Sargent Florence lasted one day. And a succession of young men, Ralph Partridge, who married Carrington, who went to live with little Strachey because Partridge was fancied by Strachey, one of Bloomsbury's many delightful triangles, Angus Davidson, Richard Kennedy, and perhaps most significantly of all, John Lehman, in himself a poet of the period, who first joined the press in 1931 but left the following year. He then returned 6 years later, in 1938 as a partner, buying out Virginia Woolf, only 3 years before her death. I do wonder, if she hadn't sold out of the Hogarth Press, whether the interest of the press wouldn't perhaps have given her sufficient reason to carry on when she felt suicidal in 1941. Under Lehman's influence, the Hogarth Press published works by an emerging new generation of poets and writers. He was very good in one way for the press, such as Stephen Spender, W.H. Gordon, Julian Bell, Cecil Day-Lewis, and the novelist Christopher Isham. All illustrious names, all very well worth doing. And Lehman ran the press with Leonard for 8 years, but increasingly they couldn't agree on the direction it should take, and eventually Leonard bought out John Lehman, as Lehman had bought out Virginia, and sold the press himself to Chatto and Windus, where it became an imprint in their list. Still is, actually. Only Chatto itself has been sold to Random House. Such is the very sad fate of publishing in our day. As anyone involved, even tangentially, in publishing books knows, and I speak from long experience here, it's a very messy business. All those things that have to be looked at, first of all, you have to have the author. Then you have to have the text, and that means authoring, asking for advice, giving advice, editing, all of that. And then you have to produce the book, and then you have to sell the book. The Wolf's first job was probably the easiest of all, since by printing themselves, they had their own authors. And they were surrounded, as I said, by lots of aspiring authors. They also both shared an interest in Russian literature, which gave them a whole new field that they could publish in translation. Virginia herself, translated a number of the Russian texts, and Leonard also, in conjunction with Kotelyansky, who gave him a kind of rough draft in Russian, which was then translated more elegantly by Virginia or Leonard. And they also, besides that, they kept the interest up by publishing a series, 3 series, 4 series, 5 series, a series of books, which I think usually are a very good way of interesting people, of actually judging whether it was an interest in it. They had things like the Hogarth Essay series, one called Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, in which Virginia herself discusses fiction and what is really needed in her opinion, and how out of date Arnold Bennett seems to her. There was also the Hogarth Letters series, Letters to a Young Poet, by Virginia Woolf, writing to John Lehman. Hogarth Living Poets, all those young poets I mentioned to you. Then once the completed manuscript, which sometimes only started as an idea in someone's head, was ready, it had to be edited carefully, usually by Leonard or Virginia themselves. Printing followed. Meantime, other aspects of production had to be considered. Jacket. We have just started printing, Virginia wrote to Vanessa. I want your advice about colours. So one stage was gone, there's the next stage. It's worse than actually producing a can of baked beans. It really is. I mean, publishing has so many aspects to it, and so many of them out of one's control. But also, they have to sell it. The all-important business of selling your books. And this is where many publishers don't do very well. They want to make a modest profit so that they can carry on. And Leonard, to begin with, had this very interesting idea of a subscription list. He would have an A subscription list in which the people would buy all the books you published, and that took great faith. And then there would be a B subscription list. Do you know what this noise is?
It switches itself.
Will it die down? Oh, it will go. Okay. Well, we'll carry on. You finish. So there's the A subscription list and the B subscription list. Customers who could choose which titles they wanted. Once they had the announcement of their new press ready, Virginia sent it out to all their friends. She was quite shameless in her touting of the business. I admire this in Virginia, and very tentative about selling her books. She sent it to all their friends, pestering the closest of them so that they might feel obliged to buy the books. My dear Otterlin, she wrote to Otterlin mother in 1917, I've just sent you a halfpenny envelope containing a notice of our first publication. We find we have only 50 friends in the world, and most of them stingy. Could you think of any generous people? They need not be very generous, whose names you would send me. If so, I should be very grateful. She's very much more humorous than one thinks of her when you see that rather solemn face. The announcement was probably sent also to a list of Omega Workshop supporters, which Leonard Woolf had asked for from Roger Fry, canny man. Thank God for that. Yes. The Woolfs' appeal to friends brought in good orders, despite Virginia's claim about their stinginess. But the American author, the one I mentioned to you, Logan Pearsall Smith, maintained that they must go further afield in their sales efforts. So we got to go around the bookshops next week carrying our wares, Virginia complained to Vanessa. It all sounds a little too American to be altogether to one's liking. What a wonderful snob. My husband Cecil remembers going round the bookshops of Brighton with Leonard. He has some lovely stories which he tells in his little book that we published, The Other Boy at the Hogarth Press, when Leonard would take him round, and as a very, very hungry schoolboy, lunchtime would eventually arrive, and Leonard would say to this boy, 15, 16, he'd say, are you hungry? Cecil would say, I am rather. And he would go into a baker's shop, Leonard with his very careful control of finances, and buy 2 penny buns, and would then put it down in a notebook so that he had a note of the fact that he'd spent 2 pennies on 2 penny buns. Anyway, sorry, that is beside the point. Next, simultaneously with the bookshop visits, the books had to be sent out for review, with what possible dramatic results you can see from that review from the TLS. Of course, it did help having writer friends who were reviewers. You could always have them for a good dinner beforehand. Finally, and physically most demandingly of all, there was the packing and dispatching of the books, all done by the Woolfs themselves, as late as the 1930s, with the help from their small staff, and sometimes from their even smaller nephew, Cecil. And in this, and it's lovely, we published it ourselves, as you know, in this little book, he remembers being in the basement of, I mean, isn't that exciting? Hogarth House in Tavistock Square. He says, in those pre-war days and early in the Second World War, I also stayed with Leonard and Virginia in the house in Bloomsbury, Tavistock Square, where they rented 2 floors at the top of the house and carried on their publishing business, the Hogarth Press, in the basement. By the late 1930s, that basement was the centre of frantic activity. Clerks toiled, telephones rang, authors and sales reps, known in those days as travellers, came and went, carriers delivered, and when the packer failed to keep pace, no one, not even Virginia, was exempt from this chore. I needed no encouragement to join in, and I can remember my fingers becoming red and sore and cut with doing up parcels of books. There were the days before jiffy bags and sellotape, because they transformed life rapidly. The office staff and packer worked on a large table at the front of this basement. The manager occupied what in Virginia's time had been the butler's pantry. The basement of 52 Tavistock Square was uncompromisingly functional and the atmosphere informal. As for the decor, the walls were a dingy cream and lights had dark green shades. It doesn't sound in the least exciting, I know, but to a schoolboy it was all very exhilarating. You can imagine, can't you, at the age of 13 or 14, he was 14 when Virginia died. I have been eating my meals, incidentally, for almost 50 years off that table where they packed the books in the Hogarth Press basement. That's very exciting. As early as 1924, 7 years after starting the press, Virginia's life, with the exception of her own writing, which was sacrosanct and occupied her for those 3 hours every morning, Virginia's life was taken over by the press. So the more successful they became, the more... That's poems by T.S. Eliot. In one of, there were variant covers for this, and that's a jacket by Vanessa Bell of one of Virginia's books, To the Lighthouse, and that is another decorative jacket by Carrington, and lovely book of woodcuts by Roger Fry. So as early as 1924, 7 years after starting the press, Virginia's life then was taken up with the press. She's putting the final touches to Roger Fry's book on Duncan Grant, and she says her whole day goes in stamping a little notice in one of the books that's been omitted in the typesetting, and there are about 550 or 600 books to put it in, folding 600 pages, addressing 600 envelopes. It refers to Roger's new book, We Are in an Awful Rush and Muddle. A few months later, she is confronting the complex daily grind of the press, and I love her simile, her comparison. We all run about the basement, distracted, hen-like, with wisps of string, labels, brown paper, now answering the door, please come in, yes, I'm the advertising manager, yes, we'll give you 33.5% on numbers over 12. No, we don't keep songs at sunrise, they come to us for it all the time, and we don't publish it, and so on and so on. The press has suddenly become monstrous, kicking and sprawling. And of course, she was still helping in the press in 1938, even though she sold out her share, as you've seen. With Virginia's suicide 3 years later, it might have been prevented, as I suggested, if she had, I don't know, is that perhaps just invention on my part, but maybe with enough to distract her, she would not have committed suicide. But Leonard's own interest in the press after her death diminishes. So intimately had he and his wife of nearly 30 years been involved in it, and he sold the press 5 years later, in 1946, to the much larger more commercial publishing house of Chatter and Windus. The imprint was retained as a symbol of all that was worthwhile in publishing and as a homage to Virginia and Leonard Woolf's vision when they set it up in the dining room on the table in 1917. Hogarth Press books today are worth a small fortune, so we won't leave this T.S. Eliot unguarded when we go out of the room for a short break. But and greatly admired even by connoisseurs of art, not the printing itself, but the whole concept of the book and the personal contribution. The Hogarth Press is really important lies not in its printing, but in its contribution to 20th century thought, free as it was of the demands of the editorial boards and high-powered businessmen and accountants of larger publishers. Many of the press's publishing decisions were, as its one-time manager John Lehman pointed out, revolutionary. Though its titles were often regarded as highbrow, sometimes sold only in small numbers, they would eventually filter out and become part of the great works of modernism. And I've told you some of their successes. But I want to end this part of the lecture and give you a short break with Virginia Woolf's own words in 1938, the year that she herself sells out to someone, an imaginary person, asking about private press printing. Still, madam, she says, this is in 3 guineas, 3 guineas. Still, madam, the private printing press is an actual fact and not beyond the reach of a moderate income. By using these cheap and so far unforbidden instruments, you can at once rid yourself of the pressure of boards, policies, and editors. They will speak your own mind in your own words, at your own time, at your own length, at your own bidding, and that, we agreed, is our definition of intellectual liberty. Thank you. And I'm going to talk about the legacy of that afterwards, and Cape Town's own publishing ventures into this area. 10 minutes. Thank you. I'm very impressed that you haven't all disappeared. In fact, you look larger. Right, so what we're going to talk about now is the legacy, and legacy in a very general sense. I don't want you to think that I'm claiming that at least 3 of the publishing houses that I'm talking about in Cape Town are directly descended from Hogarth, but I think that spirit of the small press definitely is an important factor that they cultivated, if you like, right at the beginning. When Leonard Woolf sold the Hogarth Press imprint to Chatto and Windus in 1946, only 5 years after Virginia's death, the Hogarth Press, as we know it, came to an end. Since the Woolfs had no children of their own, to their mutual regret, Leonard even had a name for the daughter he thought they would have, which is very sad. That would appear to have been the end of one of the most interesting publishing ventures in the early 20th century. Yet, in a sense, the Hogarth Press, of course, was the child of Leonard and Virginia Woolf, the child they never had. Virginia certainly thought of it as such at times, writing to Barbara Bagnall, who worked at the press and had just had her own child. Virginia complained to her, I assure you, the press is worse than 6 children at breast simultaneously. I can't quite envisage that. Hence the comparison, I think, with the sow which follows. Consider the sow. She shows, I think as a humorist, she hasn't had enough publicity, has she, Virginia Woolf? Consider the sow. She shows no embarrassment, but Leonard and I live apart. He is in the basement, I in the printing room. We meet only at meals, often so cross that we can't speak and generally dirty. His triumphs always coincide with my disasters, probably spilt a tray of type on the floor, When one's up, the other's down. Then you and the sow say that maternity is worse. And this child of the Woolfs grew up and in turn gave birth, I suggest, to other offspring. I was interested to come across one clear example of this during my recent work on the writer Robert Graves, who had 6 of his less accessible works published by the Hogarth Press, starting with his long poem, The Feather-Bed, very unreadable, I have to confess, in 1923. The Woolfs would also agree to publish a collection of poetry recommended by Graves by John Crowe Ransom, who was a very well-known poet eventually in America. His collection, Grace After Meat, with an introduction by Graves, and would invite Graves to write an introduction to it because they clearly trusted his literary judgment by this time. He also recommended, and I'm not sure how literary this was, but he also recommended Laura Riding's work, which most publishers considered unpublishable, and they published 2 books by Laura Riding. And when Graves's literary agent, Eric Pinker, was looking for a publisher for his Meaning of Dreams, which was a book Graves wrote in the 1920s, which Constable had thought it too dangerous for them. Perhaps he gave Freudian interpretations to it. Graves suggested, after this failure, offering it to the Hogarth Press. It is not a book that will sell by commercial advertising, Graves writes, and if at all, will sell on its own merits among highbrow public, so please try Woolf with it. Enclosing an essay on contemporary techniques of poetry with another letter to Pinker in 1925, he would observe, Hogarth Press is the only firm for a book of this kind. Graves did not visit the Hogarth Press in person until the end of April 1925, but told Sassoon, Siegfried Sassoon, his great friend at that time, who had, but he very much wanted to meet the Woolfs as early as February 1924. And when he did finally turn up on the doorstep, I thought I'd just give you an idea of the kind of thing that was always interrupting Virginia's day. Not her morning, which was inviolate, but her afternoon, when she thought she was going to have a nice little read, or perhaps talk to a friend, somebody would turn up. On this occasion, it was Graves. Turned up unannounced at 52 Tavistock Square on the 24th of April 1925. Virginia feared at first that what she called the bolt-eyed, blue-shirted, shock-headed, hapless young man in a blue overcoat standing goggling on their doorstep was one of the geniuses, she's being ironic of course, who wrote for Leonard at the Nation, he edited the Nation and Athenaeum, anxious to unburden himself, she says apprehensively. Although Graves had only come only from the nearby London Zoo, which he'd been visiting with his children and Sassoon, he seemed to Virginia to have been, quote, rushing through the air at 60 miles an hour and to have alighted temporarily. She's having great fun, but she has difficulty in getting rid of him. tendency to exaggerate, not unlike Graves's own, Virginia's subsequent account of someone physically striking with, quote, a crude likeness to Shelley, possibly a genius, but undoubtedly still very young and uncertain of himself, is a fair picture of Graves, aged nearly 30, and a vivid glimpse into what kind of an interrupted existence being at a press gives you. I've often gone to her own door and found somebody standing on the doorstep saying, I desperately want this book, do you sell it? Laura Riding in particular would always have difficulty placing her own highly experimental work with publishers, and it was partly in an effort to bolster her by freeing her from editors of the publishing world in general, that Graves, after the runaway success of Lawrence and the Arabs in 1927, first biography actually of Lawrence, would spend a sizable amount of his earnings from Cape on a printing press. He discussed the idea with D.E. Lawrence, who thought that owning a private press was one of the richest things a man can do. Lawrence had wanted to own one with Vivian Richards, a friend from Oxford, since their pre-war time together. But his subsequent travels, because he was always off into the desert or to Cairo, wherever, made it impossible. But Vivian Richards had gone on to own a private press, and fortunately was able to advise Robert Graves and Laura about purchasing their own. And he found a Crown Albion of 1872, similar to the one William Morris had used at the Kelmscott Press. A large machine that printed 8 octavo pages at a time. It weighed 17 hundredweight, close to a ton, but nonetheless was hauled up to their maisonette, where it was installed in its own private room in pristine splendor. And Nancy Cunard, who also had her own small press, the Hours Press in Paris, noted the terrific cleanliness, clinical tidiness of everything when she visited, remembering the Crown Albion in particular with its accessories about it. In a way, no printer would take time off to keep so clean, almost as if in a museum. Laura's obsessive tidiness and perfectionism, I mean, I think if you want to be a private printer, you must not want to be tidy. Certainly, if you want to be a publisher, you must not want to be tidy, as Virginia, I think, indicated. It would make printing very stressful for Laura Riding, not for Robert. I mean, Robert Graves would quite happily wear 2 mismatched socks and not even notice himself. The somewhat recherché name of their press, Season, S-E-I, oh, it's up there, isn't it? The Season Press, is an arcane legal term meaning possession of land by freehold. It was almost certainly chosen to signify possession of the means of production. According to Laura, one may hence read back into the launching of the press with Season for its name, a spirit of moral resolve to use it well. Of course, what she really meant was, I can now publish my own books, and I don't have to keep being rejected by publishers out there. That's what she really meant. She didn't mean they didn't want to have fine printing. That was not their aim, as with the Hogarth Press. There were recently founded presses like Nonsuch, Greynog Press, which produced very beautiful books. But like Hogarth, it was content that mattered. Our editions, the prospectus read, are decidedly not addressed to collectors, but to those interested in work rather than printing of a certain quality. Miss Riding and I publish no books except those we consider necessary and which you commission from necessary people, Graves wrote pompously, very pompously. In other words, we are not looking for books, which of course is a little bit off-putting when the poor agent is offering them to him. Robert Graves' father, who was a poet, foolhardy enough to suggest an anthology of family writing, and there were lots of writers in the family, was rebuffed with equal firmness. Both Robert and Laura found a home for their less popular works at the Hogarth Press, as you've seen, and which this undoubtedly influenced their own decision to buy a press. Riding's biographer, Deborah Baker, argues that the founding of the Seized Press was also an answer to Bloomsbury and its Hogarth Press. Like Leonard and Virginia Woolf, however, Robert and Laura did not find printing easy, despite Vivian Richards' patient help and encouragement. Laying the type was both complicated and demanding. I mean, if you get one space, what they call an M, a printer's M, EM, if you just get one tiny space and you lift up the tray of type to carry it over to the machine, it shakes and the whole of the press, the letters come out onto the floor, and you can imagine you then have to painstakingly pick up each one and put it in its own book and do it all over again. Dampening the pages they found very difficult. If you made them too wet, you ruined them. If you didn't make them wet enough, you couldn't print. Especially for a perfectionist like Laura, it drove her mad. But the printing of their prospectus was fairly straightforward compared with that of their first book. And I don't think you'll be surprised to know that the first book was by Laura. Love as Love, Death as Death was called this deathly collection of poems, one of 7 books published at the press between 1928 and 1934. A far more ambitious and extensive project than a one-page prospectus, of course, because poetry is not easy to set. Letters are even harder to set because of that need for a heading and a date and all the rest of it. It took them a year to produce 175 copies of Love as Love, Death as Death. And by the time it was ready, not for death, Laura had already got Gertrude Stein, nice name to conjure with, to agree that she would submit something to the press. And Stein wrote an acquaintance with description for them. Well, this was even harder to typeset because they couldn't decide whether it was prose or verse. They did publish it, and it was a success. The Seized Press would prepare one more work for publication in England before Graves and Laura left for Mallorca in 1929, and that was Graves's early 1929 poems. 4 more in Mallorca they published before becoming the outlet for Laura's ambitious series of, I suppose, essays and letters, and a magazine called Epilogue, which would run between 1935 and 1939. But by this point they had joined forces with a bigger commercial publisher, Constable, who published in conjunction with them. And they could, of course, then relax a bit more. It's less of a time-consuming business for them. Still an important part of their identity. When Laura ended her 14-year-old relationship with Robert Graves in circumstances as dramatic as her leap from the 4th-story window in 1929, which is why they, and his jump after her, which is why they went to Mallorca in the first place. That brought the Seized Press, as they had conceived it together, to an end. Graves obviously had enjoyed printing, but he wasn't going to go on with it for the rest of his life. Congratulating a friend on his nice printing, Graves writes, in 1947, long after they'd stopped printing, I was a printer myself once. This week I'm selling my press, paper and type. No time for that very exacting art. And I need the press room for a bedroom. The much married Graves were actually only married twice, but 4 children from each marriage had a problem with bedrooms. But like Hogarth Press itself, it had been a very idealistic venture which turned commercial. What we might call the grandchild of Hogarth Press was something started up in Canada, and I would like to talk to you about it. It was called the Ladysmith Press. Well, this is a Len Lye book jacket for the Season Press. Len Lye was a New Zealand artist, beautiful, imaginative, extraordinary, a filmmaker really, very experimental, very modernist, and did a lot of covers for the press. I thought you'd like that. But what I was going to say was that there is another press that I could actually provide for grandchildren to the press, but we haven't got time, I'm afraid, some of their covers. Instead, I want to talk about another press, a press which, of course, was related through blood, and that is Cecil's Press, the Cecil Wolf Publishers Press, a much longer-lived offspring, because the Ladysmith Press came to its end in about 1963. Sorry, 1963. Do I mean that? Yes, 1963. Cecil Wolf Publishers was started by an actual relative of Leonard, his only nephew, Leonard Wolf, who had come, Cecil said, to regard him as his surrogate son. I told you how sad Leonard was not to have had children, and as Cecil grew older, they were often together, usually up to mischief. He started his own small publishing house in 1960, almost a decade after I met him, and one of the first things we talked about, I remember, which I'm afraid is not to my credit, was whether he should change from letterpress printing. Anybody who letterpresses knows that that hitting of the metal on the paper is what really matters. But litho could come in, lithographic printing, and Cecil was absolutely distraught at the idea that he had to change from letterpress to litho in order to keep going. What should I do? He said to me. Do you know what I said, litho? Because of course, you see, these modern methods overtake. Well, it's happened all over the place, hasn't it? I mean, all the hand-created things, all the hand surfaces, if you like, have gone. Well, Cecil had first-hand experience of the Hogarth Press, as we've seen, as a child of 12 or 13, helping pack books in the basement of their house, and he'd also been round Brighton soliciting orders with Leonard, so he had some vague idea of how chaotic publishing was. The Hogarth Press was a very personal business, he believed, and of course it became so from him. Looking back, he thought of the basement of 52 Tavistock Square as, quote, where, in a sense, I began my publishing career, a lifelong love affair with books and publishing. Other occupations intervened. Briefly, some years of soldiering as a very young man, the end of the First World War, a few years in a family stock jobbing business, most unlikely, but quite shrewd actually in such matters, some freelance writing, and several years in the antiquarian bookselling world before his final venture into the small press world. He regarded Leonard as a standard to aspire to as a publisher, and wrote, he was humane, had good literary judgment, which of course was very important because he was the one who really believed in Virginia from the start, a healthy regard for money, and the ability to make crude commercial decisions. And it's that funny conjunction, isn't it, of being businesslike enough to keep the press going, but also critical and sensitive enough to be able to make the right choices. One of Cecil's passions as a scholar was for the turn of the century writer Frederick Roth, or Baron Corvo as he liked to be known. And in 1960 he put on a Frederick Roth exhibition, a highly successful exhibition. But he also wanted to publish some essays on Roth, and he also had several other books by other people he was interested in. And so he set up his own publishing firm with that book. Well, not, this wasn't the first one, but with the book by Corvo at the beginning. He quickly went on to publish other people, and his encouragement of young and not so young writers like Leonard became legendary. I think without Cecil's encouragement, I would never have become a writer. Oh, you can do it, you know, we want to publish it, that sort of thing. And I'm sure small presses have that same experience of actually feeling proud of having encouraged somebody to venture into that big, awful world of publishing. A list of the books he published in those early days before I joined him shows how eclectic yet wide-ranging his tastes were, and how creative and proactive he was. And some of the books which I actually witnessed the creation of show that really they were Cecil's ideas. When he got to know Colin Wilson, I don't know whether you know the writer Colin Wilson, in the old reading room of the British Museum, which is where I met Cecil, shortly after the success of Wilson's book, The Outsider, for example, he suggested that young as he was, Wilson should write his autobiography, and Wilson's Voyage to a Beginning became one of the press's early successes. He nursed, this is a delightful story, he nursed Quentin Crisp, you know, the naked civil servant. He nursed Quentin Crisp with endless crates of Guinness through the conceiving and writing of another book. He said, well, look, you know, it was so successful. Why don't you publish something for us? Oh, well, I don't know what. Cecil said, well, let's think about it. That took several crates of Guinness. And they did. And they came up with a book called How to Have a Lifestyle, which sold and sold and sold, was certainly one of our early successes. I remember jacketing books on the way from the printers as we sped off towards the nearest theatre that was putting on his one-man show, Crisp's one-man show, based on the book, How to Have a Lifestyle. Of course, I have to boast that the purple and pink of the cover was based on the colour of my gloves, which we took round to the printers, who were very puzzled. There were more scholarly books, such as William Morris, Joyce Tompkins' masterly approach to Morris's poetry, or Harold Brooks, T.S. Eliot as literary critic, or an edition of J.M. Mary's unpublished play, Ibsen's Ghost, or biographies of Isaac Rosenberg, Charles Hamilton Sawley, and editions of their poems and letters. I don't know whether I can get this without risking terrible damage. No, I can. But this little book, which is an edition of Rosenberg's poems, we published with Cecil deciding on everything, the cover, everything. I mean, it was just such an exciting thing to do, but very scholarly of him to want the editions of the letters and to want the editions of the poems. And his own edition of Corvo's letters, which you can see on the screen, was one of the press's greatest hits of this period. And as if that weren't enough to keep anyone busy, shortly after we moved in together in the 1970s, our first child, Katie, was born, and Cecil became, as the children often called him, Katie, Mummy Daddy. Cecil had wanted to call Katie Virginia, and since my married name is Woolf, that would have meant that poor Katie was going to be called Virginia Woolf. And I put my foot down and I said that was not fair to any child, and she could call herself Catherine Virginia Woolf, and then she could show off if she wanted to. But he was not sure. He spent the first dinner we had together talking about how superior D.H. Lawrence was as a novelist to Virginia Woolf, which outraged me. But he was evidently proud at some level of his connection with the Virginia Woolf, and would later publish one of our most successful series in the press, the Bloomsbury Heritage series, which I did show you. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of commercial stuff here. But it was always Cecil who would say, we need a cover. We need a cover that's sort of Bloomsbury. And I'd say, well, who can we ask? And he'd think of somebody, and then he'd write that, and he'd say, no, it needs to be more Bloomsbury, and then we'd discuss the cover. And it was always a very personal business, as it was with the Wolves. I was working on a biography of the Jewish poet Isaac Rosenberg just before and just after the birth of our second child, Philip. Cecil had been a great admirer of that First World War poet, whose sister Annie Winnick he got to know. Like her, he thought Rosenberg shamefully neglected, and had promised that he would publish a biography of her brother. When the author he commissioned took it off, he helped her for 6 years, and she then took it off to a larger publisher. And I was so indignant on his behalf that I wrote my own biography. So you see, he was responsible too for me. That's my start as a war poet's biographer. Cecil came to fatherhood relatively late, but he did nothing by halves. And an early 50th birthday present was our third child, Emma, born 2 years after Philip. A third publishing child, a little later, would be a third series of monographs, this time of the Powys brothers, with the main focus on John Cooper Powys. Oh, I omitted to say that with Isaac Rosenberg, we started a series called War Poets, the War Poets series, and we did a series cover, and that also has proved to be really rather popular. A third series on the Powys. But what I want to read you is what something he wrote about Cecil when he died last June, because I think it showed that, like Leonard and Virginia, he had a very personal interest in the press. Unlike Leonard, I don't think he was a very good businessman, and I think that perhaps was part of his charm. I'm not sure. Somebody wrote about Cecil and his Powys, John Cooper Powys series. His passing marks the end of a period of publishing in this field that is unlikely ever to be equalled. The Powys Society owes Cecil an enormous debt of gratitude. From the time he began publishing volumes of Powys's letters in the early 1980s, his interest never wavered, and where large publishers, you see the difference between the small presses and the large publishers, would steer well clear of them, Cecil was willing to commit the effort and money to publishing letters, diaries, essays, monographs, and all sorts, despite their limited popular appeal and the near certainty of financial loss. No other publisher has done more over such a span of time to maintain the profile of the Powys and encourage interest in them. And I do think the idealistic part of the small press needs to be emphasised greatly, because nobody but an idiot, nobody but a raving idiot or an idealist would start their own small press. And then 2 more children, Alice and Tristram, forgive the egotism. The 1980s revealed quite a different side, and this is where I want to end with Cecil Wolfe Publishers. His interest in politics, mine gradually whipped up as I became indignant over the various wars that followed. When I first met Cecil, he'd been co-editing a book for Cape called Authors Take Sides on Vietnam, for which, incidentally, he'd successfully solicited a contribution from Uncle Leonard. It was in part Leonard's own involvement in politics which had influenced Cecil, as well as his friendship with the writer Nancy Cunard when he was a very young man, who had edited Authors Take Sides on Spain, which we reproduced later for our series. A book which in 1937 Leonard had also contributed to. When the Falklands War broke out in 1982, Cecil asked me if I would edit an Authors Take Sides on the Falklands with him and then publish it ourselves. I agreed, but well aware of his tendency, his very leisurely view of time. I said it was with the proviso that we got it out quickly, and then I went off to W.H. Smith's and I said, we're doing this, big retail outlet in England, and I said, we're doing this book, would you like to order it? I belonged to a small press which was used to getting orders in the nature of 5 books, 8 if you were lucky, 10 if you were very lucky, and came away with an order for 2,000 copies of Authors Take Sides on the Falklands. You have no idea. I was heavily pregnant at the time, and I remember distributing finished copies to the authors, that was their payment, on a bicycle, heavily pregnant. It's a very personal business. But no, this was very, very successful. So successful that we had to go into a second edition, but the order was given on condition that we got the book out in 3 weeks from manuscript to publication. And we have been telephoned ever since by desperate people saying, how did you do it? But no, it was very exciting. I remember going to deliver Salman Rushdie's copy, and he looked at my heavily pregnant state, and obviously a much nicer man than his books give the impression of. He said to me, come in and have a cup of tea. And then told me how exaggerated were the claims of the sales of Midnight's Children. Well, that wasn't the only book that was published by us in the political line. Authors Take Sides on Iraq and the Gulf War followed by us, edited by us, and Authors Take Sides on Syria was in preparation when Cecil died, and I was so busy with volume 2 of my Robert Graves that I really haven't been able to pursue it, but I'm hoping that I own some of them. As Lois Gilmore argues in a paper delivered to the Virginia Woolf Society just days before he died, Authors Take Sides is a significant series showing how, quote, a small press claims a neutral space, provides a forum for multiple voices to express opinions about war, peace, and social justice. And I think that is one of the functions of the small press, that you can do things that you couldn't risk as a larger press. As a result, a direct result of Authors Take Sides on the Falklands, one of the contributors, the Labour politician Tam Liel, asked if he could write his own book on the subject. And I said yes, and then found myself writing the book for him. That's beside the point. It had his name on the cover, very important, and it sold very well. Again, reprinted within a week of publishing. The Falklands conflict, which wasn't very big here, but was very big in England, also spawned 3 more in the Men and Documents series. But you can see how one thing leads to another, and how exciting the world of publishing is, and how exhausting it is, and how frightening it is. You put large amounts of money into this, and sometimes they don't come back. The last decade of Cecil's life was occupied mostly with his work on the Bloomsbury Heritage and War Poets series. And he was delighted to be made an honorary member both of the Virginia Woolf Society and the Robert Graves Society in recognition of his efforts. And another unexpected pleasure was being invited to go to the Norman Douglas conference. You probably never heard of Norman Douglas, a very good travel writer of the earlier part of the 20th century. Well, Cecil was born too soon to take to computers. In fact, he drove me mad. Even I knew more about computers than he did. But too late to consider printing his own books on a small hand press, even though he had one in his laboratory, as you know. So he was unable to benefit fully from desktop publishing. He was also not tough commercially, not nearly as tough as, even I was tougher, and no, I'm not tough either. But it was still a going concern, the press, when he died last year, and I'm hoping that our eldest son will help me keep it going. But it is very personal. That's the difference, I think, one of the differences. All the small presses I've mentioned, Hogarth, Season, and Cecil Ward publishers, were started initially to publish works by the founders themselves and their friends. But when I turned to small presses in Cape Town, I discovered, or in South Africa generally, I discovered that a significant proportion of them were started for even more altruistic reasons. I must stress here that my selection is fairly eclectic. You mustn't take this as the last word on small presses. And none of them, post-desktop publishing, started on a hand press. In the second half of the 20th century, several local South African publishing enterprises were notable for their championship of the struggle against apartheid. I mean, firms like African Bookman, A.D. Donker, David Phillips Publishers, which has become New African Books, Scotiaville Press, which was founded in 1982, the first black-owned publishing house, well, no, not the first, but one of the first, and the Sached, or S-A-C-H-E-D Trust. But the full history of South African publishing in the 20th and 21st centuries is far too complex, and I'm not suggesting that this is in any way a full history. I want to look instead, in the closing minutes of my talk, at a few Cape Town publishers whom I found very interesting. I'm not for a moment suggesting, as I said at the beginning, that they are consciously emulating the Hogarth Press, but their presses seem to me very much in that tradition. One of my earliest examples, now no longer functioning as a publisher, is Black, B-L-A-C, founded in 1974 by the writer James Matthews during the apartheid era against great odds. I don't know whether you know of James Matthews, poet himself. Still alive, celebrated his 90th birthday last year. Born in 1929 to working class parents in District 6, where Rosenberg himself stayed, of course, when he came to Cape Town. Grew up in a household virtually devoid of books, he said, and it was at school, encouraged by his English teacher, that he started to write. But it wasn't until he left school to become a messenger at the Cape Times that he saw a library for the first time and became enamored of books. His reading up to that point had been limited, he wrote, to James Hadley Chase, which I thought was, I like James Hadley Chase. Despite these odds stacked against him, Matthew started to write in earnest at the age of 17, had his first writing, prose and poetry published, and through his poetry, he became a leading spokesman for the black consciousness philosophy. But when his first collection of poetry, Cry Rage, which was co-authored with Gladys Thomas, was published in 1972, it was banned by the apartheid regime. as were most of his later works. After establishing the first black-founded art gallery, Gallery Afrique, in 1972, Matthews went on to start that first black-owned publishing house, Black, standing for Black Literature, Arts and Culture, in 1974. It would close 17 years later in 1991 due to constant harassment by the government of that time. He himself was placed in detention from 1976 to 1989, from September to December 1976.